Hello, everybody. I'm very pleased to be here. Alas, speaking in English. I understand French reasonably well. I read it fairly well, but I don't speak it very well at all. So thank you for indulging me. So I'm from Ontario, and I'm an economist. So my approach to the issue is different than that of Natalie and Lee's, but quite complementary, as you'll see. So let's see. Okay, so what I'm going to try and do is to talk about a study that we did in Ontario about the Ontario childcare system making recommendations to the government, and this was last year, and the results of that. Then I want to try and review as best I can the childcare policies of the different parties in Quebec briefly, and then talk about them. And my discussion about them will be informed by being an economist, by being from Ontario. So you may have to add things that are the perspectives that I don't have in the question period. Free childcare for preschool children in Ontario. I never thought that I would be able to say that, but for a brief time, there was the glimpse of free preschool childcare in Ontario, because the report that we wrote, 300 pages long, and so I won't present all of it tonight, but recommended that the main best thing in order to improve the affordability of childcare in Ontario, the next best step would actually be to offer free childcare for preschool-age children. And that means a different thing in Ontario than it does here in Quebec. So preschool for us means from 30 months of age, 2.5 years of age, up until kindergarten starts, which is, well, it varies according to when you were born, but somewhere in between 3 years and 8 months of age and 4 years and 7 months of age, depending upon your birth date, is so in that period from 30 months of age, from 2.5 years of age till 4, basically, to offer childcare free of charge to children in Ontario, and to develop most of that through the not-for-profit sector, as I'll describe. So that was the main recommendation that we made in this study for the Ontario Ministry of Education. And so what we recommended was free childcare for preschoolers, more funding for children of other ages, and all new developments to be in the not-for-profit and public sectors. Where can you get the report? If you're, I will blow my own horn here. I would say that if there is one thing you're going to read about the Ontario childcare system, this report would be it. It is a very comprehensive report. I had other people helping me write it, but it's a very comprehensive report going through both history and reality of the Ontario childcare system. And the Ontario childcare system is complicated because we have municipal responsibility. So we have 43, I think it is, municipalities in Ontario that take responsibility for delivering funding, some for development of the system, and play a big role in finding out what parents need and developing what parents need in Ontario. So the whole discussion of all of that, as well as all the other aspects of the system. But anyway, you could, on this website here, www.childcarepolicy.net, you can get either the English or the French version of the report, or if you're less ambitious, go for the executive summary, which is only 22 pages long, so that's more manageable. Alas, the new Ontario, that was with the old government just before the election, and it turns out that that party did not win the election. I'm sure it was not because of this, but the government which has come in does not favor that approach and will not follow it through. It was actually adopted, that approach, the main recommendations of the report were adopted by the government and prepared and put forward in their budget. So it would have been policy and would have been implemented right now. But the new government is a conservative government and favors, this comes from you, the tax credit approach. In fact, an exact replica of the Quebec tax credit approach with exactly the same numbers and so on, despite the fact that our childcare costs much more than yours, so that those numbers make much less sense in the context of Ontario. Nonetheless, they have recommended this in exact form as what we should adopt in Ontario. And a very strong favoring by that government of for-profit childcare. So there was a limitation on the development of for-profit childcare in Ontario, which they have now eliminated. And so some operators will be very pleased with that. Many of you will not really know the Ontario childcare system very well, so here's a brief description. There are about enough licensed childcare spaces for 23% of the children 0 to 4 years of age. Most of it is in the not-for-profit or public sector. We have a small amount of public sector, municipal-owned childcare centers, but most of it is not-for-profit, and about 25% is for-profit. The main funding system is what's called the child care subsidy system, available for low to middle income families. And what that means is that the subsidy that you get will depend on your family income, but also a requirement for work or training in some form. And this subsidy system has been around for a long time. Well, you would have had something similar before these more recent changes in the 1990s. So from the 1960s through till now, we've had a subsidy system that is developed like this. But it means that you'll get a full subsidy if your income is less than $20,000 a year, so a very low income. And above that, you'll get a partial subsidy. And by the time you've reached maybe $80,000 of income, there will be no subsidy left at all. So it's for the fairly low income, maybe low to middle income families, but quite a lot of money does go into the subsidy system. But that's the main form of funding that exists now in Ontario. We do have pretty good regulations from a quality point of view. So our ratios for infants are 3 to 10, 1 to 3.3. So the size is usually 10, of course, because it's hard to do 3.3. But 3 to 10 is the ratio for infants, 3 caregivers to 10 children. 1 to 5 for toddlers. Now, again, the terminology will not be the same for you. So infants for us is 0 to 18 months of age. Then from 18 months of age to 30 months of age, it's a toddler. And then above 2.5 years of age, a preschooler until you get into kindergarten. But the ratio is then 3 to 10 for infants, 1 to 5 for toddlers, 1 to 8 for preschool children, so up to age 4. We do have universal full-day kindergarten in schools, both junior kindergarten and senior kindergarten, so both for 4-year-olds and for 5-year-olds. And kindergarten has existed for junior and senior kindergarten for years and years. I don't even know exactly how long, but as long as I can remember, so that's 40 years or so, we've had JK and SK, and pretty universal. Senior kindergarten universal for all that time, and then about 85% of children in junior kindergarten for most of that time as well. So now they were half day. They were recently moved to full day kindergarten for the school day and the school year. It does have, however, a play-based curriculum in Ontario. With one kindergarten teacher in a classroom and one early childhood educator in a classroom. So there's been a very strong attempt to move kindergarten from the scholarization, schoolification way of doing kindergarten, which would have been our history as well, to much more of a play-based curriculum. And that's been a strong move in the last number of years. So that's free of charge before and after school care is paid for by parents. Childcare is not affordable in Ontario. If you happen to live in the capital region of Canada, around Ottawa, and you have young children, you want to go live on the Gatineau side for sure. You don't want to live on the Ottawa side. Because the typical prices of childcare here, $9,000 to $21,000 a year, or $35 a day to $80 a day. And then you go down below. So my reality, living in Toronto, these are median, so not the highest by any means, but these are the center of the distribution. $87.50 a day for infants, $68 a day for toddlers, $56 a day for preschool age children. So I mean, even for a preschooler, you're putting out $13,000 a year in Toronto, and much more than that if your child is younger. So childcare is definitely not affordable. For the study that we did, we developed different measures, ways of measuring affordability, and these are pictures of those. So there are two different measures. This is measuring by family income. And looking across Ontario, we did work with the census, a whole bunch of modeling, which is of great interest, but we don't have time to discuss the details here. I can answer questions about it. But when we did that work, we said, really, about 19% of Ontario families can be said to be able to afford licensed childcare. And most of those are the ones that are eligible for subsidy, right? And 35% would find childcare to be unaffordable, and that means between 10 and 20% of their total family income would go towards paying for childcare. And then nearly half of Ontario families would have to pay between over 20% of family income in order to be able to afford childcare for their preschool-age children. The picture looks fairly similar if you take quite a different measure, which is what we call the main caregiver's income, and usually that means the mother, although it depends upon the family, but usually the mother. If you take the mother's income and you ask what percentage of the typical mother's income would be eaten up by the price of childcare, well, and this first measure at the top says affordable, less than 30% of her income. 30% is already a pretty big number, but we're calling that affordable. So 22% of families in Ontario would eat up less than 30% of the mother's income in order to be able to afford child care. But for another 33%, it would be between 30 and 60% of her income, and then another 45%, it would be over 60% of her income. So if you wonder why childcare and the decision to work are strongly related to each other, well, it can make no sense whatsoever to work if you're in the completely unaffordable area. So when you take the numbers across across all families, for families that have a child 0 to 4 years of age, licensed childcare on average costs over 23% of total family income after taxes. And if you put that in terms of the mother's or main caregiver's income, it's on average 67% of the mother's income is eaten up by the price of licensed childcare. Well, again, no surprise, price matters for parental decisions. Employment and childcare are very closely related to each other. And as we all know, lack of affordable childcare is a major barrier to women's workforce activity. So a picture of that, those categories I talked about, completely unaffordable, affordable, unaffordable. If you look over to the left-hand side of this, if I put you in the category of completely unaffordable, that is to say it's going to be 30% or more of your total family income, only 32% of those families will have the main caregiver employed in a full-time occupation. Even that is incredible. Like, how is she managing to get into the workforce and have a full-time occupation? Well, the answer is she's not using licensed childcare in general. She can't afford that, but she'll be using something else, or else she gets a subsidy. It's possible she's getting a full subsidy. But, and then as you look along to unaffordable and affordable, as you move over towards affordable, for families that actually can afford licensed childcare, there's a much higher percentage of them in which the main caregiving parent is fully employed. Economists love graphs. Maybe you don't. I don't know. I'm going to show you a couple here. But this shows you, because we did a lot of estimations in order to build models here, but this shows you what we estimate to be the relationship in between the price of childcare and full-time employment. Is it full-time employment? I think it's all employment, actually, not just full or part-time employment. And what you see on this, if you look over to the left-hand side, on the left-hand side of this line, what you have is a high probability, measured up that way, a high probability of using licensed childcare and a low price, at 0 at the far end. And then as the price of childcare rises, that line plummets downwards. In other words, employment of the main caregiving parent plummets downwards as the price of childcare rises. So the next diagram is a wonderful diagram, and I'm going to spend the next half hour describing it to you. That's a lie. I'm not going to spend the next half hour describing it to you. But there's one nice thing about this diagram. It actually answers the question, okay, well, if the main caregiving parent stops being employed, what's the alternative? What is it that replaces it? So if you take these top two lines here, one of them sort of bluish purple, and the one below it is red. As the price of licensed childcare increases, I'm moving from the left to the right of this diagram, as the price of licensed childcare increases, the probability of using licensed childcare goes down, but these two lines go up. And what are these two lines? And the answer is, one of them is she's not in the labor force at all. That's the top one, that purple one. And the other one down here, which is maybe a little more surprising, the red one, says the parents or the relatives look after the care and she's employed part-time. So that's what happens, is she moves out of the labor force into a part-time job, tries to hold on to the labor force, you know, with her fingers as much as she can in order to support the family, but has to move into a part-time job with parent and relative care. Okay, so as part of this study, we developed principles that should guide good child care policy, and this summarizes some of the key ones. Well, first, that early childhood education is good for children and families. Second, that quality matters a lot. Third, that, as we just saw, parent decisions about work and children are very sensitive to the price of childcare. And what that means is that good quality at low prices in a full-day program is going to end up maximizing the benefits from childcare. So that's really what we want. We want a policy that moves us towards good quality at low prices in full-day programs, because that maximizes the benefits that come from childcare to both children and families. Next, that families facing disadvantages can benefit the most from good quality, affordable childcare. So childcare policy should ensure that they get full access. Next, that childcare and parenting are complementary to each other, not substitutes for each other. So a good program should facilitate parenting. It should facilitate communication with parents. It should facilitate communication in between children and parents as well. So we need to think of them not as substitutes for each other, but as complements for each other. And policy needs to facilitate that. This now is more in my wheelhouse as an economist. Childcare is in essence a public service, not a market commodity. And a lot of people have taken Economics 101. A lot of politicians, I think, have taken Economics 101, and they didn't go any farther in economics than that, and they probably didn't listen after about week 3. And so what they learned was that competitive markets are good and they solve all kinds of problems and they're brilliant, and you get low prices and you get great quality and you serve consumers' interests and needs, and that's what you want. You just let her rip, let businesses run and let her rip, and that's fine. You'll get the best of all possible worlds out of doing that. Well, those later weeks in economics that they missed, in Economics 101 and the later courses that they didn't take, suggested that that way of thinking has tremendous limits. And we're in a situation with childcare where a couple of things are true. One, it's quite hard for parents to accurately perceive quality. Second, parents are in general highly stressed out. There's not enough supply. They're going to choose whatever they can. So on the parental choice side, there's limits to the theory of parental choice. And most of the money that is in childcare, and this is especially true in Quebec, most of the money that's in childcare, where does it come from? Does it come from parents' pockets? Not really, in some ultimate sense maybe, but it comes from government. It's government money. So if you think of consumers voting with their dollars, which is what the theory is in Economics 101, well, the consumers aren't voting with their dollars. It's government money. It's subsidies. It's subsidies on the supply side. It's subsidies on the demand side. It's this and that and the other. So what producers are doing is chasing those subsidies. That's what they're doing. They're not serving consumer demands, consumer votes, consumers voting for quality and low prices. So the whole theory of the way in which a market works doesn't really work very well in the childcare area. And so really what we've got to recognize is that if 80% of the money or more is coming from the government, in essence, childcare is a public service or a public commodity. It's a public good. And then the mechanisms that are going to control what producers provide, because it is a market in which there are private providers. Okay, they're not for profit or they're for profit, but they're private providers, and that's the way in which we've organized that particular market. It's not public sector producers. We could organize the world that way, but that's not the way we've done it. So it's private providers, but we need to regulate their behavior and incentivize their behavior, but it's not that the market is going to control it in some reasonable sense, as Economics 101 might have said. So market competition ends up not providing high quality and low prices, but rather we're getting low quality and rising prices. Final principle here, I'll say more about it later, but is that transitions are important. And we actually call this the Quebec problem. Okay, and this may not be entirely fair, but let me say the way in which we think about it in Ontario, which is you did a brilliant job in the late 1990s thinking about what should happen in early childhood education. And you said we need good quality CPEs and we need to organize them this way. And even at the beginning, the CPEs sort of managed the family child care underneath them. And it was a wonderful system in theory, but in practice, the transitions kind of killed you. Not completely, but nonetheless, the transitions really harmed the development of the system. And the major problem with the transition was you didn't think that so many parents would want childcare when you offered it for $5 a day. But you know what? You should have had an economist in there telling you what would happen, because we know that price is really, really central to most goods, and particularly to this particular service. And so what you had was, because you hadn't prepared that transition, you hadn't said, we can only increase demand at a rate at which we can increase supply of the good quality services, you in fact lost control over the development of the system. And that's when the idea of having high quality, not-for-profit services completely dominating the provision in the sector got lost. And parents, reasonably enough, said, hey, you promised me my cheap childcare, I got to have it today. And so all the for-profit sector came in and you lost control of quality and so on. Not completely, there's lots and lots of good features of the system, don't get me wrong. And Natalie's presented on some of those here, for sure. But nonetheless, the transitions are very important. So when you're developing good policy, think through how it's actually going to happen. Are you able to, in economics we call it the law of unintended consequences. When you don't think about the transitions well enough, you have a whole set of unintended consequences and things don't go the way that you had actually thought about them in theory in your mind. So that's important. Okay. So what things did we consider in the study that we did? We considered free preschool childcare, of course. We considered a flat fee, like $20 a day is what we talked about, not $5 a day, but $20 a day. We talked about what we call a sliding scale, sometimes here seems to be called progressive pricing, so different prices according to income. The particular one we looked at was under $50,000 free, above $150,000 pay 80% of the full price, and then in between those you pay more and more as your income rises. Or demand side funding, the tax credit, in fact, looking at the tax credit from Quebec, which you probably know quite well. I'm sorry, I keep putting these graphs in here. I can't control myself. But one of the things that we looked at in this study was the issue of how does the policy you adopt affect how much money the family gets to keep, right? So looking at the question, what is the return to employment? Because, of course, we think of the return to employment as being, well, you get 100% of whatever your wage is, but you don't actually get 100% of your wage because you have taxes, right? And you've got all kinds of different taxes, and for us CPP, for you QPP, and unemployment insurance and different things like this that take money away from you. So you only get a portion of what your full wage is. And then if you think about childcare costs, they come off as well. So this is looking at if you're a single parent, and we did this for two-parent families as well, but this is perhaps clearer. If you're a single parent and you have a toddler, so a child 18 months of age to 30 months of age, so paying those fairly high rates for toddlers, how much would you get to keep? And so the numbers along the side, on the right-hand side of the screen, show you get to keep 100% or 90% or 80% or so on down there of whatever your income is, whatever your wage is. And then these three lines show different alternatives. And the top one is, what if you had no childcare costs? How much would you get to keep? And then the next one is, what would happen if you had your childcare costs, but there were no subsidy system, as there is in Ontario? And then the third one, the red one, is what happens if there's a subsidy system and you get a subsidy. And it's just interesting seeing how policy affects this. So when you're thinking about policy, you should think about these kind of things. That's really the argument. So the top line, that dark blue line, says if you're a single parent and you're earning the different amounts that are along there. So that's at one end, it's $10,000 a year, 20, 30, 40, 50, so on, $1,000 a year. So most single parents are actually way over to the left of this graph. Only a few would be farther on. But what you see is that actually you don't get to keep anywhere near 100% of your income, even if there's no childcare costs. We're in at maybe 70 to 80% of your income is what you get to keep, but no more than that, even if you have no childcare costs. And then if you add childcare costs on top of it, let's go to the purple line. Here you're not eligible for subsidy, and you're into negative territory, right? I mean, you're into negative territory. You can't I mean, it makes no sense whatsoever to work at all. But even up here, up to about $40,000, if you don't get a subsidy, it makes really no sense at all to work, right? But then the subsidy system in red comes in and it restores some of the reasonableness of work. But anyway, it's trying to look at what is this relationship in between policies and the encouragement, the support that we need to have for parents to be able to work. So it's an important thing to think about, which we tried to do. The interesting thing about this particular graph, the red line, again, is the subsidy system in Ontario. But this one that's perhaps brown, rust-colored, it shows you what about the tax credit. What if you had the tax credit? And you can see that the tax credit here, if I put the Ontario numbers on it, is really not very helpful to low-income families. It's in fact quite negative and certainly much worse than our existing subsidy system. So one of the arguments against the tax credit system in Ontario is it's worse than what we got now. So why would we want that for all these single parent families that are earning less than about $50,000 or $60,000? It's worse than we've got now, not better. And it's going to discriminate against low-income earners rather than to help low-income earners. And from our principles of what good policy is, we actually want to favor low-income earners, if anything, and make sure that they have access. So this kind of thinking went behind what we did. Okay, so I'm cutting to the chase more quickly here. Free preschool childcare, we modeled the effects of it using the census, using some regressions and a number of other things. Free preschool childcare would dramatically improve affordability. Childcare for preschool children in Ontario is already very popular, and that means that there's quite a bit of supply already. So increasing the demand for it doesn't get us so much into the transition problems that I talked about, right? The supply, there's quite a bit of supply already. Yes, you'd dramatically increase the demand, but we thought we could handle that. The demand for childcare for children 0 to 6 would increase by about 100,000 in Ontario if you moved to free preschool childcare. And it would cost $1.6 billion a year. So we had a model that modeled exactly what would happen, how much it would cost. And the $1.6 billion a year doesn't include revenue effects. So there are, I forget how many, but increases in tax revenues for governments that offset some significant part of those total costs. Full-time employment of main caregiving parents would rise by over 40,000. So that's where the tax revenues are coming from, and that means you're providing a considerable amount of support for work. We argued for using supply-side funding to encourage and enforce quality requirements, and that all expansion should be in the not-for-profit sector. And then over time, expanding the child care for other ages of children, and that this alternative, the free preschool child care, was in fact better for low-income families than the other funding alternatives that we considered. Okay, well, now I've finished about Ontario. And like I say, it's 300 pages long, so you're going to have to go and download it and have a read. Okay, so I'm not from Quebec, so what am I doing up here talking about Quebec policy? Well, I'm trying to provide a light, to shine a light on it from all the work we did thinking about policy in Ontario, and hopefully that is useful to you. As I understand it, I mean, we've got 4 parties here that I'm going to look at in Quebec: the Liberal Party, the CAQ, the PQ, and Quebec Solidaire. Really, right now, the Liberal Party is, in some sense, responsible for the current look of the system, right? Obviously, it started under the PQ and was adapted, but dramatically changed over time by the Liberal Party. So you've got subsidized childcare at progressive prices based on income for some children. You've got tax credits for unregulated childcare, but also unsubsidized licensed childcare for other children. You've got a big expansion over the last number of years, especially the last 10 years, in for-profit childcare. And you've got junior kindergarten for about 4,300 four-year-old children in low-income neighborhoods. New this election, actually one of these is a little bit wrong, Natalie tells me, but the responsibility moves to the Ministry of Education. That's interesting. I'm not sure how I feel about that. In most of the rest of the country, the move into the Ministry of Education has been quite positive for childcare, and most provinces across the country now have childcare in the Ministry of Education. In Ontario, we moved from Ministry of Community and Social Services into Ministry of Education, and the interesting thing about it is, in the Ministry of Education, they expect things to happen. Ministry of Community and Social Services, it's welfare. It's just poor people. Okay, if it works, if it happens, it happens. But Ministry of Education, it's sort of, they make the trains run on time a little bit, right? So that actually has been positive for childcare. There's been more studies done, more collection of data, and more implementation by the Ministry of Education than was the case in other ministries. So I don't know. I'd be interested to see if anybody wants to say something about what it means to suggest moving into the Ministry of Education here. As Lee's talked about with the pilot project, it is recommended that there are going to be evaluations of quality now on a regular basis in licensed childcare services, and Lee's is leading the charge on how to do that in a good way. So that's wonderful. And that is a very big step. That's a very encouraging and good step, long overdue. Free childcare services for children of families in need apparently is already in the legislation. But the new part is free childcare services for all 4-year-olds in licensed childcare. So we'll give a clap with one hand for that. I mean, if it was in CPEs and if it was good quality, you'd feel good about it. Does this just mean another big, profit center for firms who are in the business of doing that? You do have some regulations against big box childcare here, but in fact, a number of the big box childcare firms are already in Quebec, and having a 4-year-old free childcare would be seen as a big profit opportunity by them. The CAQ, Coalition Avenir Québec, they of course want to keep the dual system of low-fee childcare for some children and tax credits for expenses on others. But they want free kindergarten for all 4-year-olds, as Natalie's talked about for sure, for the school day and school year for $311 million. Now, my problem is that I'm an economist, so actually if I see a number, I sort of sit down and try and do some calculations, right? So let's think about $311 million a year, because we do know that right now the junior kindergarten, or that's what we call it in Ontario, so pré-maternelle for you, it is pretty bad quality. I mean, Krista Japel's study said it's poor to very poor is the average quality in the existing junior kindergartens. So that's the starting place. And $311 million, okay, so the CAQ estimates that there's about 81,000 children will come into the system, into 4-year-old kindergarten, if it's offered for free. So 311 million divided by 81,000 gets you about 3,500 a year, or if you work it out on a daily basis, 200 days a year, it works out to about $17 a day. So for $17 a day, we're going to get really high quality junior kindergarten. What's wrong with that story? I mean, with a CPE now, the average cost is apparently about $55 a day to the government, somewhat less than that in family daycare. But $17 a day really doesn't even get you on the starting, the first rungs of the ladder. And by the way, that $311 million does also include the capital costs of building new classrooms. So actually my calculation was extraordinarily generous. It's probably more like $10 a day as the average cost. So I have to look at that and say, what type of quality is being talked about when you're talking about 4-year-old kindergarten free? I'd say as bad as it is now and worse. So I mean, that means that kindergarten and Ontario's kindergarten are completely different. Okay? What's interesting is that in Ontario, junior kindergartens existed for, like I say, forever, for 40 years, and now it's become pretty good. Okay, there's difficulties. Schoolification issues are still there, even though there's a play-based curriculum and so on. I mean, there are issues, but the caregivers are relatively well paid, higher paid than workers in other areas, childcare workers in other areas. There are a lot of resources that goes into it. That's not what's being talked about here in terms of 4-year-old kindergarten for Quebec. So they can't be talked about in the same sentence. Ontario does not equal the future of kindergarten in Quebec. They're not the same thing as far as I can see. Okay, I kind of got off on a tangent there, but return to the flat fee for licensed subsidized childcare is in the CAC program, and enthusiastic support for-profit childcare. Parti Québécois, who were the originators of the system back in the 1990s, they want to freeze the development of for-profit childcare spaces and encourage those centers to transform, the for-profit centers to transform. Ontario's experience with transforming for-profits into not-for-profits is not so great. We could talk about that if you like. It's not as effective as people think it's going to be. But they argue that all new development should be in the CPEs, and the CPEs, as we know, have been found to be of quite high quality relative to the other parts of the system. And they say that there's going to be 26,800 additional spaces in the CPEs, which they say is just about the right number to clear the waiting list for the CPEs. That's the argument. No expansion of junior kindergarten. The best place, they say, for 4-year-olds is in the CPEs. I believe Natalie might agree with that. She does. And a lot of people might agree with that. And eliminate the progressive pricing, well, or change it at least. So a fee that varies according to the family size. So a reduction in fee for the second and third children. And make the fee free if the income is low enough, or half price in a moderate position. And a guarantee of a place in licensed childcare for all children. This is not something you could implement immediately, I guess, but they talk un enfant, une place, une réalité. A very nice slogan. Many of the European countries do have a guarantee of a licensed space, and it's an important stage in the development of policy is to have a guarantee so that people, so people tell this story. In Sweden, this is a story of a friend of mine. When you have your child, and your child is getting, growing on, I don't know, 6 months or 8 months, somebody comes to visit you and starts talking to you about your place in a childcare center, and the municipality says, yeah, you've got a right to it, and we're going to talk to you about where you'd like to go, and let's work that all out where your child is 6 months of age, until at 1 year of age, maybe your child will go in, and oh wow, isn't that sensible? Doesn't that make sense in terms of making family life work out? So generally a good direction in which to move. No religious or faith-based symbols or dress. I have a lot more problem with that as a direction. I think that's a solution to a problem that doesn't exist, but that's my view on it. Quebec Solidaire, probably less likely to win the election, but certainly they're going full out on childcare policy, a fundamental right of access to universal and free early childhood services, a national policy of educational childcare services for all children 0 to 5, even above that, abolition of the childcare expenses tax credit, growth of CPE spaces, conversion of commercial spaces into CPEs, and participation of parents and staff in democratic management of childcare services. So, coming to the end, but trying to start us off on discussion, perhaps for questions afterwards. What are the key issues that emerge out of this list? What are the key contentious issues? And the first one, of course, is 4-year-old kindergarten. Is it good for children and families? Should it be expanded? And I've now said most of this, but since the quality right now is poor, unless you're going to put a very considerable amount of money into it and do it in a very different way, then it makes no sense. Ontario, it doesn't seem like, is the model for Quebec. And history matters. Like, you have a history now, and you have good CPs, you have the development of a childcare system, which we really haven't had in that same way in Ontario, and that works in many ways. And so, why take a part of the system that right now isn't working and make that the dominant part of the system? Why not take the parts of the system that are working well and work with those and develop those? In Ontario, our history was quite different. We had junior kindergarten and senior kindergarten. It was too schoolified. But, you know, Charles Pascal wrote a report, talked a lot about doing a seamless day with kindergarten at the basis of it, making it full-day kindergarten. The government adopted it, put lots and lots of money into it, much more than $311 million into it, and provided, you know, over several years, full-day kindergarten, which is now very well accepted, and is becoming now better and better. It's becoming more play-based and more inquiry-based than it was before. So history matters. In Ontario, that whole evolution makes sense, but it doesn't make sense as a direction for Quebec at this point.
And also you have to say that you didn't have affordable childcare.
Yes, we don't have affordable childcare in Ontario for sure, which certainly made junior kindergarten make an enormous amount of sense for families. But now, and of course, it's true for us too, that junior kindergarten and senior kindergarten are great as far as they go, but they don't do as good a job of providing employment support. I mean, it is the school day, it is the school year, and so you still have to scramble for all those other parts. So if you've already got a system which does provide good employment support, again, why not build out that system? Why go backwards towards kindergarten as the foundation of the system? Demand side or supply side funding. I'm a big proponent of supply side funding. That is to say, rather than the tax credit, which is demand side funding, give money in some sense to the parents to spend, I strongly favor putting money in on the supply side. And why is that? The answer is, when the government puts money in on the supply side, it gives money to services and then says to those services, provide it free or provide it at $7 a day or $8.05 a day or whatever it might happen to be, giving the money to the services on the supply side. When you give the money to the services on the supply side, it gives the government more control over how that provider behaves. Why is that important? It's important because quality is so important. So if the market were able to control the quality perfectly, fine, go on the demand side, no problem, you know. But if quality is absolutely central to the experience for children and families, and it's difficult, to do. It's difficult to perceive. It's something you really have to work at over a period of time. It's hard to get it right. It's not, it's not putting a coin in a slot or something like that. Well, then you want funding on the supply side that gives some reasonable degree of pressure and control to government to sort of keep pushing on the quality issue. And so for my money, supply side funding is a much better way to go than the demand side funding because of quality. And the same kind of logic applies to commercial versus CP childcare. I mean, the Liberal Party certainly has proposed, and the CAC proposed that both for-profit and not-for-profit childcare can be good. That's a true statement. Both for-profit and not-for-profit childcare can be good. But we now have evidence that on average that statement's not true. It might be true at the extreme ends of the distributions, but that you can have good quality for-profit childcare and you can have bad quality not-for-profit childcare. That's true statement. But the placement of these distributions of quality can't be ignored. The CPEs are of considerably better quality on average than the for-profits of either kind. And that has to matter enormously for policy. So putting pressure on to measure quality and to enhance quality, some of the things that Lee's is getting involved in, that's great. That's an important thing to do. You do have both for-profit and non-for-profit in the system, so you've got to work with that and try and improve them. But on the other hand, in terms of who you should favor, policy should be favoring the CPEs because that's what's worked in terms of the improvement of quality, and quality is so important. And then you have to keep thinking about these issues of transition. There are a bunch of issues that have to do with transition. They are things like, is your supply able to keep up with demand? So don't increase the demand too much. So if you're going to free for 4-year-old children, you have to figure out, okay, what's that going to do in terms of the demand for extra spaces, and can we meet it? And can we meet it with good quality childcare? And if we can't meet it with good quality childcare, should we slow down the making of free, 4-year-old spaces free, right? So thinking of those transitions, and staff. Do we have adequate staff to provide the good quality? So both on the physical supply, but also on the staff side, there are all kinds of transition issues that really have to be taken into account every time you think of what good policy is. There are some other transition issues too, but all, the transition issues ended up being absolutely central for our recommendations on free preschool childcare. It turns out we ended up saying that because if you only provided it for this narrow age range, we had a decent chance of providing sufficient supply and getting sufficient staff to do a good job for free preschool childcare. Other people said, oh no, it's the infants and the toddlers you should really help. There are huge affordability issues there, but we said, no, if we try and do it all at once, we're actually not going to be able to do a good job of anything. And so the transition issues ended up helping us decide that in Ontario, free preschool childcare was the right next step for affordability. I think I'll stop there, and thank you very much.
Alors, je vous invite à vous rendre au micro pour les questions. Vous pouvez poser les questions en français.
Ça va être étrange. Alors, ce que j'aimerais connaître, c'est que pour compléter le portrait comparatif que vous nous avez présenté, qui était évidemment fort intéressant, est-ce que vous pourriez nous décrire la structure de groupe dans les maternelles 4 ans en Ontario, c'est-à-dire le nombre maximum d'enfants par groupe dans une classe et le nombre d'enseignants et, je crois, d'éducatrices qu'il y a dans une classe pour qu'on puisse comparer avec ce qui se fait ici au Québec, s'il vous plaît.
Thank you, and thanks for the translation, so I can understand. So the rules on junior kindergarten in Ontario are a ratio of 1 to 13. It should be what the ratio is, but it's not a maximum in the same sense that the childcare ratios are. Okay, it's an average. Okay, because it's in the school system, the childcare rules don't apply. So they say 1 to 13 should be the ratio on average. But because they said, we don't want that with a teacher. Okay, so kindergarten previously, when it was half-day kindergarten, was taught exclusively by teachers. That is to say, trained with a 3 or 4 year degree and then 1 year of teachers' college, Bachelor of Education on top of it, but not with an early childhood knowledge or an early childhood specialization, or even, I mean, you could be expecting to teach grade 3 children, and you ended up in kindergarten. So you didn't necessarily have any particular background. So the idea was, okay, we want to have early childhood educators in there partnering with the teachers so that we get the early childhood knowledge in the classroom. And so they work together as a team, as partners. Okay. What that means in terms of how the numbers in the classroom is that you then have to have, because you've got 2 teachers in the classroom, your 1 to 13 now becomes 2 to 26, right? And it certainly can go as high as about 30. It's not supposed, like I say, the average is supposed to be 1 to 13, but it'll go as high as 2 to 30 rather than 2 to 26 in the classroom. And relative to you, that, you know, you can argue this one way or the other. I think your numbers are 1 to 15 or something like that in a 4-year-old kindergarten classroom, but you won't have 2 to 30, you'll have 1 to 15. So then it's a question of how much does the group size matter, 15 versus 26 or 30. But you can see how we evolved towards it in Ontario, which is we very much wanted to move towards more of a play-based, inquiry-based curriculum, which means that you've got to have the early childhood educators in there. And if you're going to have them in there, either they have to replace the teachers, which would have caused a complete firestorm and strikes and everything else, or you have to work out something where they're partners, and then you have a classroom of 26. So, I mean, anyway, that's where we've ended up, is sort of a 2 to 26 numbers in the typical classroom.
Hello. First of all, thank you for this fascinating presentation. I was wondering mostly, what was your experience as a researcher having this huge research and this very fact-based document that was mostly dismissed by a new government, and the change for that, because I feel like what we're experiencing here is that we have very strong data, we have strong recommendations, but sometimes it falls into a depths here. I don't know if it's the correct English expression, sorry. So what was your experience as a researcher, as a person, and what do you think would be the next step for us or for the research community?
Thank you. I started listening to the translation, and then I realized you were speaking in English. Well, I did have the experience of being incredibly, incredibly happy. Probably the happiest I may have ever been, certainly as a researcher. Because I'm not used to doing a research project and for a government and then having the government adopt my recommendations. I mean, maybe I've been making bad recommendations in the past, but anyway, they adopted it really in whole. They said, yes, this is the right direction. I mean, it's a 300-page document, so there are tons of recommendations, much more than what we've gone into. But they basically said, yes, this is the right direction. We're going for it. They held a session, had the budget of the province, and included the spending in the budget for the province. So yeah, this was complete acceptance of the recommendations we made. So great joy. But then, well, I mean, the difficulty was that the government, in fact, had been around for 15 years and now was a somewhat unpopular government. So it was seeking redemption, but its plea for redemption came a little bit too late. I haven't had any contact with the new government. They're not calling me. I don't think it's a problem that they don't have my email address. I think it's more than that. No, I mean, the trouble is that this new government has a completely different approach and point of view than the other. So we are in for quite difficult times in Ontario in relation to childcare policy. It's quite possible that the numbers will, like I said, we have 25% for-profit centers now. It may be 50% in just a few years' time, and a whole change of the funding system. So, so that's how do I feel? Not very good about that. But where do we go from here? It's difficult because this is a government. There's a quote which I don't have in front of me, but that Doug Ford made at the Conservative Convention held in Halifax, where he said, "How did we win? We didn't listen to the academics. We didn't listen to the experts. We didn't listen to the special interests. We didn't listen to anybody that knew anything, and we just listened to the people," which means the people that are lobbying them intensively to get into the childcare field. So it is a problem. Like from a researcher's point of view, how do you deal with that? I mean, I guess we have to go back to what we know the best, which is trying to put facts forward, trying to put evidence forward. Which, I mean, I must say, this team, which I guess I'm a part of, but on the other hand, a lot of times I'm not here, I'm very impressed with the incredible work that this team does in fact-based investigation, putting forward really good information on topics that are absolutely central to the development of your childcare system. So I would hope in Ontario we do a lot more of that.
Bonjour, Claudette Petra.
Pat, simplement juste pour vous dire qu'en quittant, on a un petit abstract. En fait, j'ai préparé une photocopie avec les principaux résultats de la recherche. Donc, on les avait ramassés. Très belle copie couleur. Merci.
Alors, pour la dernière question.
Alors, Claudette Pétrobin du regroupement des centres de petite enfance de la Montérégie. Je voulais poser la question, à savoir, vous avez parlé, entre autres, que dans les maternelles, maintenant prématernelles, il y a une enseignante et une éducatrice. Ma première question, c'est à savoir, est-ce qu'ils ont le même salaire? Est-ce que la spécialiste est mieux payée que l'autre?
Yeah.
Oui?
Yeah.
Ou c'est...
Yes, that's true. I don't know what the numbers are, but teachers in Ontario, that is to say, ones with a Bachelor of Education, have historically been relatively well paid, relative to other teachers in other places. So when the child care educators came in, they couldn't quite figure out what they should get. They're getting considerably more than early childhood educators in most centers across the province, the early childhood people, but they're not getting as much as the teachers. I don't know what the relative numbers ended up being, unfortunately. But the point you raise is important generally, which is, I talked about this team, but this team is more true in theory than it is in practice yet, okay? So in some places the team is very good and works very well, but in many cases the teacher says, I'm the boss, right? And you clean the brushes, kind of idea, So there are this is going to take years for this to evolve into the right thing. But previously, under the previous government, there was very strong support for moving towards the play-based inquiry curriculum and making it happen in practice, and empowering the early childhood educators. Now the new government, I expect they will be saying, no, we want cheap labor as much as possible in the classroom. So I expect that actually we'll go backwards on this issue as on others. But it was a good work in progress up till now.
Mon autre question, c'est juste, vous avez parlé du coût prohibitif des services de garde pour la petite enfance. Il y a quel pourcentage de mères qui travaillent, qui sont à l'emploi en Ontario par rapport au Québec? Ici, c'est 70% et plus de femmes qui sont sur le marché du travail. Chez vous, c'est combien?
We were always above you before the late 1990s, right? I forget, at that time, we were at 69% and you were at 62% or something like that. And so we probably haven't moved very much from where we were. Your numbers are probably over 70% now. But I'm not exactly sure what the numbers are in Ontario, but we haven't moved very much from where we were then. And you've really shot up enormously with the child care being much more affordable.
Merci beaucoup.
Alors, au nom de l'équipe, on vous remercie pour votre présence.